Good evening, everyone. I can invite everyone to have a seat. Welcome, I'm Rabbi Felicia Saul. I know most people in the room, but not necessarily everyone. If this is your first time at BJ, we're really excited to have you here. If this is your 100th time, we're still excited to have you here for what we know will be a really meaningful evening. Just a couple of things. We ask that people shut off their cell phones so that we're not interrupted in any way. Very nice. Sometimes I write notes for things and sometimes I don't, and this time I actually wrote the things out that I wanted to say, and then our printer went off network, and my specific printer in my office lost its ink. So I took a picture on my phone of the things I prepared to say because, when we talk about the subject of race and us, we can't just speak off the cuff. We have to really give it intention. And we as a community, I as a rabbi, have been thinking about this subject for a really long time. And in many ways, this night is a culmination of years in process to get to a point where we're looking to have a community conversation. So I'm going to share my reflections between a paper with some half ink and the phone that, thank God, we're living in 2019. I also just want to welcome everyone on behalf of myself, Rabbi Rolly Matalan, who's still in Argentina, sitting Shiva, Rabbi Aaron Glazer, and Rabbi Shuli Passau, who I will introduce later. So, in 2005, Eliana Slursberg became a bat mitzvah here. Not here, actually, at the church. And she offered a Devar Torah about being counted in community. And this is what she said, a selection. Today I stand before you proudly as a Jew and as a child of color. Her mom is sitting right here. In the United States, Jews are commonly pictured as a white ethnic group, yet our Jewish multiculturalism has always been a part of our history. She told the story of having overheard a little girl ask her mother what a black person was doing in BJ. She said, "I hope after today the response will be, because Jews come in all colors." She concluded her Devar Torah saying, "We each need to open our hearts and to do some serious reflection in our own lives so we can be more inclusive of others who are different from ourselves." Eliana is now one of the chairs of our Race and Us Steering Committee. She's actually teaching tonight, which is why she's not here, along with Vicki Abrams and Julie Kowitz-Margulies. Over 15 years have gone by since Eliana's Devar Torah, and over those years there have been many moments and experiences communally within BJ that raise up the question, who is the we of our community? Who is here and who is not here? And why? And do all those that walk in our doors feel honored for who they are? That is one reason we have launched this work on race and us. Printer down. Over these 15 years, the Jewish community writ large is doing its own reflection on how we understand ourselves, who we have held up as the American Jew, which is typically a white Ashkenazic Jew, and how race and ethnicity, amongst many other aspects of our identity, are invited in or marginalized within the Jewish community. And that is another reason why we are launching this work on race and us. Over these years, there have been issues that have been divisive in the Jewish community on the intersection of race and Zionism and anti-Semitism, like the Black Lives Matter platform, or with regards to former leaders of the Women's March. In those difficult conversations which raise big questions, the voice of Jews of color have often been erased, and Jews of color have been asked to choose between the Jewish community and the community of color that they're a part of. And that is another reason we have launched this work on race and us. Over these years, we know the names of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Eric Garner, amongst countless others. And the questions have been raised up in countless ways how this country has never really confronted its racism at its core, and all the ways it plays out in 2019 still, interpersonally, institutionally, and structurally. And that is why we have launched this work on race and us. Over the last years with Charlottesville and Pittsburgh and Poway, we see how white nationalism is on the rise and how its ideology centers around the intersection of anti-Semitism and racism, and how communities of color and Jews within communities of color and communities, Jewish people who are of color in Jewish communities, are targeted by this disease in our country, and that is why we have launched the work on race and us. And finally, because we are a community of faith that seeks to do the internal work of cheshbon nefesh, of accounting of the soul, the work of justice in the world, and that hopes this community of faith to live the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion from internally within our staff to our leadership, to our entire community, and how we live out in the world. And that is why we have launched this work on race and us. So thank you for being a part of this exploration. We are excited for what promises to be an incredible learning for our, what Yavilah often calls, our beloved community. And it is a beloved community, and when you have beloved community, it also means you can work through hard things because we can love each other through it. And that's the plan. So we're really excited to launch tonight after countless work by countless people. And the people have raised their voices from Eliana, all those years ago, to over time. And we hope that throughout the course of the year, not only the people sitting in this room, but all members of our community will be a part of the conversation. That's how we will grow. That's how we will learn. So thanks for being here. If you're part of the Race and Us Steering Committee, I would just ask you to rise for a moment so we can thank you. Thank you. And now we'd like to just spend a couple of moments turning to someone you don't know to answer one question, which is, when was the first time you understood that there was an issue of race? When was the first time you understood that race was something? Okay, turn to someone next to you that you don't know and answer that question. Okay. Last night I was at, Shuli and I had a pre-planning meeting for our trip to our civil rights trip on Sunday night with the Pastor Lee Matthews and the members of the Church of St. Paul and St. Andrew that are coming with us, and we're journeying together, and we said for the Christians, they can speak for 3 minutes, and the Jews can speak for 2 minutes, because she said her community always underspeaks, and we said our community always overspeaks. So I hope it was a meaningful conversation. I feel like we've been asking that question a lot, which is really a deep question, and raises up stories that we really don't always realize we're carrying, and that's just something to pay attention to and honor. So I have the great privilege tonight of introducing our beloved speakers, who in many ways are just not old friends, but old friends. Old friends. So I'm not going to read their bios. You can read them on the website, but just to say a little bit about them. Yavilah McCoy is the CEO of Dimensions Consulting, and the way I always introduce Yavilah is to say, besides that, for me, she was my first teacher on these questions. I think it's actually 15 years ago. And she has been pushing and leading and imagining for 20 years how the Jewish community can live in its fullness as a beloved community, honoring all the stories that live in it, particularly around diversity, equity, inclusion. And so Yavilah has spoken here a number of times over the years. The first time, actually, I think, was one moment that she met Eliana when Yavilah was on a panel about diversity, the Renee Kaufman lecture. I think it was like 16 years ago. So her story with our community is deep and strong, and individually is deep and strong, and we're really blessed to not only invite her here tonight, but she's working with us over the course of the year to support our leadership, really, to carry this work forward. So we're deeply grateful that she's traveled in from Boston. She also just got this incredible award. She was entered into the Brooklyn Hall of Jewish Fame or something, which who knew existed, but she's in it. So welcome. And Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, who's no stranger to BJ either, who really, I think, he's the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, and since he took that position, basically has caused a storm in the Jewish world. In a lot of ways, the Institute has grown tremendously, not just in staffing. They just received a huge amount of infusion of money to support their work, but because it's become Yehuda and his team have really been pushing questions of thought leadership and raising questions of how to deal with difficult things like Israel or like peoplehood through learning, through the resources that our tradition gives us to wrestle. And Yehuda is the one who makes that happen, and has had a deep influence on this community through our work with Jewish identity, belonging, and community. And we hope for many years to come will be a part of the story of our learning here at BJ. So welcome. He comes not from Boston, but from Riverdale North. And finally, I think most people in the room know Rabbi Shuli Passo, who is our Director of Community Engagement. And Shuli has been championing this work in incredible ways. We've been in this discussion for many years, since she joined our staff 4 years ago. And we're really excited that she'll be moderating the conversation between Yehuda and Yavilah. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Hello. It's so delightful, exciting to be here with you and with all of you. I just want to say a word about how the conversation is going to go tonight. We're going to talk up here for about 45 minutes or so. And then on your chair or on a chair close to you, there is a white note card and a little pencil, and that's how we're going to do the Q&A this evening. So if a question comes to mind as our speakers are talking, please jot it down. We'll have folks come around at about 8 o'clock or a little after 8 to pick up the cards, and then we'll do the Q&A by note card. So if you don't have a card near you, you can grab one from a nearby chair or a neighbor who's not going to use it. Okay, thank you. So I want to begin tonight with the question that Felicia asked everyone here to answer in pairs. To ask each of you to share, what was your first memory of race, or the first time that you became aware of race? And let's use that as our entry point and then zoom out to the bigger picture. Yavilah, you want to start? Okay.
But I can go. Which one do you want?
Why don't you start?
Hi. So, I think the first thing I want to say is that, Felicia introduced me as having been a part of BJ's work for like 16 years. And I think, I just had a birthday this past Friday. And I think what's been most important to me in noticing that I've been doing this work for almost 20 years is that one of the gifts of this moment is that as I go back in time to try to count my stories, I'm blessed to be able to know that those stories are not being counted in isolation. I'm not a unicorn. I am not, the story that I tell is not only my story. There are countless Jews of color and countless leaders right now that are a part of the community that have been alongside you all of this time. But some of us have been seen and some of us have not. Some of us have been counted, some of us have not. Some of us have had access to resources and power, and some of us have not. So as I start to tell my story, I think I just wanted to frame it by saying that my job today, as the leader that I am right now, is to put my hands behind the backs of all Jews of color I meet, know, and have been blessed to be countenanced by, so that when we tell our stories, we are telling those stories in league. So as you listen to me tonight, be also listening for the stories of your children. Be listening for the stories of your community members. Be listening for the stories of people who are literally sitting right next to you, who you may or may not have yet heard. So that as I share this story, it's not additive, it's integrated into what we've always been. So I just put that preface there to start so that we don't objectify whatever it is that I represent as a Jew of color and as a leader who has a historical narrative in this place and in others. So starting there, I think I want to say to you that the beginning of my memories of being a Jew of color started with something that in my research now I'm calling being racially assigned. Race is a construct. Race is not something we come out of the womb knowing or being in relationship with. The constructs, the systems that we encounter teach us to have a relationship with race. So I happen to be a person who was raised in Orthodox Jewish yeshivas and communities. I grew up in Brooklyn. You heard Felicia talk to you about the Brooklyn Jewish Hall of Fame, who's decided that I'm worthy of being inducted tomorrow night. Okay. But I grew up in Crown Heights and in Flatbush. And in those places, I grew up going to a yeshiva. And in the yeshiva, I started in that yeshiva at 4 years old in pre-1A. And at 6 years old, I entered into the Jewish institutional educational system. It was there that I became racially assigned. Why am I using that term? Because in my home, I was nothing but beautiful. In my home, my mother looked at me and said that my brown skin was the color of the earth that gave us humanity. In my home, my mother loved on me and told me that the day I was born, the universe and the goddess laughed, threw her hands on her hip and said, this was gonna be good. This is the kind of thing I heard from my Ima. And yet I went into Jewish institutional spaces And I remember the first day when I was in Pre-1A, when my classmate Sarah Leah brought a microscope into school and let all of my friends and classmates peer into the microscope at little things we were pulling off of the schoolyard that she would put on glass lenses and let everyone look at the molecular structure through this beautiful toy that had just come out. I believe it was probably Fisher-Price, where you could look at things. I'm dating myself. Some of you may remember when this thing happened, right? Okay, but when I came to go put my eye on that microscope, Sarah Leah bristled and wouldn't let me put my face to her toy because she felt something about being that proximate to my brownness. And so she said, no, you can't put your face on it. And at that point, I noticed, why? Why can't I look at it? And she was clear, the reason why is because you're black. And in her world, black people didn't get that proximate to her reality. And so it was nothing personal to me. She had been taught a lesson about what the relationship of blackness was to her life, and I became the recipient of that understanding. Now, why am I telling you that story? Because in the context of that story, I didn't take in Sarah Leah's definition of myself as part of who I was. What I did is I went and I found somebody else and I pulled my own little ants off of the floor and I smeared them on leaves and I held them up to the sun and I was just like, fine, I'll make my own little microscope. And I did. And I don't think I've forgotten, they call it when I was in Shiva, they call it a roshem, which is an imprint. I don't think I've ever forgotten the imprint on my soul of the first encounter with being isolated, rejected, told that I can't have something other people have because of my physicality. Resilience, absolutely. You see who I became. The roshem, the imprint. Whose responsibility was it to be sure that that imprint didn't start upon me at 6? The second thing that I have to say is that was just one day on the schoolyard. There's another memory I have. My name is Yavilah, and so I was taught in my family to read the Parsha every week and to understand what the Parsha said as being relevant to my life. So I knew that because I was born on Parsha Bahar, the Jubilee, the Parsha of the Jubilee, that my mother had given me a little horn, and that horn was the horn of freedom, because Yavilah is a feminization of the word Yovel. And therefore, my name has something to do with Jubilee. So when we got to Parsha Bahar in school, and the teacher went around the class and said, who knows something about Parsha Bahar? First grade, I raised my hand and I said, you see this horn? It's because my name is Yovel, and Yovel is the 50th year celebration after 49 cycles of Shemitah, and la la la, and she's watching this little black girl essentially hold court around what the Torah has taught about her existence as a Jew. Now, what did the teacher do? The teacher smiled and looked at me and then said, absolutely right, Yavilah. And then by recess marched me over to the principal's office to have me repeat my story and said to the principal, isn't it amazing? She's really Jewish. I'm glad you find that to be funny, because it's funny sitting here as an adult, but as a child, whoever questioned that I was Jewish? What was that about? I knew I was Jewish. That's why I was sitting at a table with my parents teaching me the Parsha. What was the question, the surprise, the lack of expectation about? These now are questions about systems for me. These aren't questions about a little girl coming up as a JOC, a Jew of color. These are questions about what happens in our systems that allow the dehumanization of folks around marginalized identities to begin as early as 4 and 6, which is what the educational system teaches us is where identity development starts for all children, 4 and 6.
So first of all, I want to join in thanking folks here at BJ, Shuli, and Felicia, and all the clergy for inviting me and for hosting this conversation, and especially for the framing of this conversation as being about interrogating us, as opposed to thinking of that race as a conversation out there, and to ask us to hold ourselves accountable to mind the gap between who we imagine ourselves to be in the world and what our values are and who we actually are. And of course, it's a huge honor, Yavilah, to be in the conversation with you on these issues, in as much as you've been such a powerful leader and mentor and role model to so many of us in doing exactly that work. So I guess my answer on this is going to be more prosaic by definition, although it was a little bit of a weird, when I was doing the work of, okay, when was I, I didn't grow up in America, actually. My parents moved me overseas when I was 2 and change. When my parents were sent overseas as United States diplomats, we moved to Cairo and then we moved to Tel Aviv, and I didn't move back to America until I was in 5th grade. So the truth is, the first 2.5 years, who knows what was going on there, but my kind of coming of age years as a child took place overseas. And I think that's significant because a lot of what we're going to be talking about, especially here tonight, is specific to the American context and the American Jewish context. This is obviously a really different story in other communities in the world. Race exists everywhere. Racial injustice exists everywhere, but a lot of what we're talking about tonight is specific to the American Jewish context. I think the moment when I probably became aware of race was not becoming aware of black or brown people, but was actually becoming aware of white people. In part because growing up in Israel, I don't know that I thought of myself as being white as a Jew in Israel, but I do remember for 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade, my parents sent us to a Mamlachti Dati Israeli school. Even though we were there as American diplomats, I think it was like, well, we could send our kids for free to an Israeli public school and they'll learn Hebrew, that's great. And then when the year before we were moving back to the States, which was in 4th grade, my parents put us in the American school because our English wasn't that good, so they wanted us to learn English. And I remember meeting kids there who, in retrospect, I realized were like the first actual white people that I met. Like they were strikingly white in all sorts of ways, including like their love of American football, which was something I didn't know yet, and it was really helpful to meet them before I moved back to America so I could understand what was going on, and identifying as like, I don't know, just kind of American and patriotic in ways that, of course, we were very American. We were representing the United States in Israel, but there was something different. And in retrospect, I think that may have been a moment of realizing that obviously when you're very little that people come in different shades and colors, but thinking about those shades and colors as meant to symbolize identities in larger ways. And then upon coming back to America, moving into a community where I was in a Jewish day school, an Orthodox Jewish day school also, there were never more than 20, 25 kids in my class, and one of the kids in my class was African American, and that was a big part of his family history. And so then in my Jewish education, there was one black kid in our class from 5th grade through 12th grade. So that brought to another kind of awareness of race and the kind of normalizing of Jews of color within a mainstream Jewish community, which is a normalization that was also rooted in exceptionalism. Because by virtue of the fact that there weren't 60% of the kids in our class identifying as Jews of color, there was one. He was always kind of bearing the burden of being the object or the vehicle through which anyone else was thinking about or talking about race. And for the most part, his relationship to our class was very normal, with the periodic racism thrown in. Right? It was not uncommon for racist jokes to be out there that he would probably painfully in some ways participate in and sometimes push back against. So good news and bad news was that I felt like a return to America and an entry into Jewish education happened in relationship to people who identified as Jews of color, and yet it was exceptional and weird and not the norm. And amazingly, I don't remember ever in my Jewish education anyone in a position of educational leadership actually talking about it. Right? Talking about the fact that race is a thing, racial bias, racial injustice, racial infrastructure is a thing, and that therefore what it means to be a Jew is to be committed to an idea of Jewish peoplehood that's supposed to transcend the racial doctrines that have emerged incredibly recently in our own history. I don't remember that ever being a feature of my formal or informal Jewish education, and I say that kind of self-incriminatingly to the system in which I was raised and educated.
Thank you. Thank you both for sharing so personally, and I really wanted to start there because, as you said, Yehuda, this is not a conversation that's meant to be about what's out there, but that it's very deep personal work that everyone needs to do in order to engage in the larger sociological, historical, political questions that arise around talking about race. And so we always want to start from that place and then build out. And I want to just observe that, particularly with your second story, Yehuda, of becoming aware of the racial identity of this child in your class, we've been asking this question at meetings recently, and I've been in a number of spaces where we've been asking this question of people to reflect on their first moment of awareness. And what I have noticed in those spaces was true right here, which is that most people who are white, and this was true for myself when I thought about my earliest memory, which was of a book I had on Jackie Robinson and how he succeeded in baseball and the racism and discrimination that he faced. Most people who are white answer this question and have a memory or an awareness about somebody else's race, the racial identity of a person of color. And I'm seeing a bunch of heads nodding, so I'm guessing that that may have been true in your conversations tonight. Whereas people of color, when we've been asking this question, largely reflect on an experience of becoming aware of their own race and racial identity, whether that's because of, largely, I would say, similar to what you experienced and shared, Yavilah, of having something very negative happen that drew attention to your own racial identity in a way that you hadn't thought of it before. And I think that that is largely true and kind of mirrors the American context. I think your point, Yehuda, about this being a different conversation in America than it is other places in the world is really right, and we want to be focusing both tonight and for most of this initiative on race in America and in the Jewish community in America. That whiteness or white identity is not something that white people think about very much or aren't often confronted with very much, but that's not the case for people of color. And so I want to now begin to zoom out and think a little bit about the larger American context in which our own personal reflections and understanding of race, our own racial identity, the racial identity of others, begins to be formed. And I want to ask each of you to reflect on, from the research that you've done and the thinking that you've done, your lived experience, how prevailing notions of race in America have shaped Jewish identity in this country. And where has that benefited Jews and Jewish communities? And where has it been destructive or damaging? Or perhaps both at the same time?
So here's the core idea that I want to play with tonight, and I hope that it comes out right and that I say the right things. I feel like the only time you actually say that in the Jewish liturgical year is in the high holidays, when the Chazanim actually say that. Because I hope I say this correctly and I don't do it wrong. So I just want to say that tonight. This is a hard thing to try to say the right thing about. The story that I think has defined the success of American Jews in especially the 20th century and now into the 21st, I want to argue is based on a juxtaposition of a narrative that Jews have predominantly told ourselves about what are the core values of our Judaism, in order to be compatible with a narrative that Jews have wanted to tell ourselves about the core narratives of America. In other words, Jews have been simultaneously curating two stories at the same time: an understanding of America and its values that would be compatible to our Jewishness, and a version of a Jewishness in America that would be compatible to that vision of America. Now, we have done this in part because Jews, like all other people, don't want to live in cognitive dissonance between what we call our essential religious or identity values and the values that the place that we're in. And uniquely to America, the majority of American Jews have decided early on, I don't know when, majority of many American Jews, especially those who are white, capable of white passing, that America was a place in which the identity of Jews could be constructed without being in contradistinction or in opposition to the dominant values of the country. Most of the civilizations we've lived in, we have been coded as Jews outside of the mainstream of that civilization. America provided the window of opportunity for white and white-passing Jews to be able to identify as part of the dominant infrastructure. And the minute that that happens, we as Jews and Jewish communities start defining our values in relationship to the American story. There are alternatives, right? It could have been that Jews defined Jewishness as countercultural to the American story. But overwhelmingly, the dominant power structures of American Jewry, which again have been overwhelmingly white, decided effectively to do something different and to juxtapose and to bring into relationship the dominant Jewish values that we thought could fit into this story. A good example of this, for instance, is why Tikkun Olam became so important to American Jews in the 20th century, because it lined up really nicely with American exceptionalism. America thinks about itself as being exceptional. Jews have a narrative, by the way, conveniently in our own story, that's also exceptional. And so it becomes a doctrine that's really convenient for the alignment between Jewishness and Americanness, which is part of the thriving of American Judaism. American Judaism is an unbelievable success story. I said this here at BJ a couple of years ago. Every time I say it, people start quivering a little bit. So if you talk about your success as a Jew in any culture, people get nervous. They start citing times and other places in Jewish history where Jews talked about how comfortable they were, and then everything went south. American Jews don't take seriously enough how this community has thrived economically and otherwise in this context. And that juxtaposition has been at the core. What does it mean to tell a dominant Jewish story that is basically appreciative, that is rooted in a notion that American Jews are predominantly immigrants? We'll come back to that shortly. That assumes that the immigrant story of American Jews has been one that has been greeted with difficulty at the outset and then success long term, and that we are essentially a Jewish community that has built our values consistent with what we see as dominant American stories. What we're challenged with, I think really legitimately in this moment, is what happens when we start to talk about the American story as actually predicated on the genocide of Native Americans and built on the slavery of Black Americans, and start to say, what if the very values that I use to construct my Jewishness are actually values that are born as part of a story that is actually deeply broken? When we create that dissonance for many American Jews, we actually introduce what I think is one of the most significant obstacles for engaging the Jewish community in the work of racial justice, which is you're forcing me to dismantle a story of America that I believe has actually been vital to who I am as a Jew in America. You're forcing me to take on that posture. There's one other data point to this, or an idea connected to this, which is an idea that my colleague Alex Kay has talked about, and I think there's something there. Is he says, the part of the challenge for Jews in America is that the West, broadly speaking, constructed its identity in contradistinction to the Jew. The Jew, every society needs an other on which it builds itself. And for the West, the whole philosophical and religious tradition is built in contradistinction to the Jew as other. Jews arrive in America and discover that we are not the other in America. There's an other in America, and it's Black people. And so white Jews encountering America are translating a story of otherness into a social context in which we're not actually other. And what this does is, not only is it puts white or white-passing Jews in some sort of resistance to the project of racial justice, except to the extent that it can be integrated to their own values, but it obviously also creates the deficit that Yavilah is talking about of the inability to see that there are members of our own community who don't identify with the historical story or the ethnic story. So this is where I want to live a little bit, in what does it look like for us as American Jews to interrogate that value system that we have built that has worked really nicely with a version of the American story, and what does it mean to interrogate that American story, to read the 1619 Project as American Jews who may have viewed America really optimistically, and then to ask what blind spots those narratives about Jewishness and Americanness have created not just about America and not just about Black Americans, but also about those members of our community, those members of our people who don't fit into the clean racial, ethnic, identity, and religious categories that narrative forces upon us. That's where I want us to start, and I don't quite know where we go, but that's where I want us to start.
So I want to ask you to respond to that, because I think you probably have some insight into some of those questions, Yavilah.
Yeah, it's you got to take it slow. I think the only way to do this is to really take it slow. And I think this idea of like Jews falling into a category of racial ambiguity probably could be traced through systems and structures in the United States, from the earliest Jews who came to the United States on the ship that Columbus sailed to America and were forced upon, and coming upon the shores of what wasn't America, but what was being called America, to choose between their status as citizens and the people who were indigenous to this country being called savages and being in need of a racial assignment in order to create a delineation between civilized and savage. Civilized and savage. So that happened as a result of Christian hegemony. Our relationship to Christianity is traced back to the earliest days of our Jewish derivation of identity itself. And the reason why I say that is because if I go back to year 0 in the Crusades, we actually were a people that were localized in a place called Pumbedita, Iraq. This is where the Talmud was written. This is where we sat on the floor in gates, like most Arab cultures taught. When you learn scholarly work, we sit on the floor in community, in collectives, and share wisdom in the academies that formed our communities, yes? But from our times here in the United States, what I ask questions about why is it that we start counting the derivation of the Torah from Germany and Mainz instead of Pumbedita, Iraq? And what I come up with is the impact of white supremacy and the Crusades. Because when the Crusades started to move into the Middle East and Africa and create that derivation between civilized and savage, that was a white supremacist endeavor. White supremacy did not start at the shores of America. White supremacy started with the colonialist endeavors that began in Europe. And in order to create those colonialist endeavors, human beings had to be turned into savages. Where did Jews fall in that? When we trace our history to places in the world that were now deemed by the Crusades to be savage. Did we stop counting those folks as essential, as core to the derivation of our identity itself? So the reason why I say take it slow is because I go all the way back to year 0 in the birth of Christ when I'm talking about Jewish identity. At what point did we stop counting ourselves as we really were? Then I move forward. I move forward to the people that were forgotten often in the context of how we derive Jewish identity. What happened to, Ibn Ezra? What happened to the people that codified the Talmud, that stayed in places like Italy, that stayed in places like Jerusalem, even prior to 1947? What happened to all of our history in Middle Eastern, African, and Arab lands once the Crusades hit us? Is that not us growing our identity in the context of a white supremacist endeavor? To me, yes. Once we arrive in the United States and we're told that there's a choice to be made between our very survival, our ability to accumulate access, resource, and power in this country, our ability to do things like vote, there are curious choices that I see us making in regard to our Jewish identity, in regard to our participation in the slave trade. Rhode Island, close to where I live, is one of the oldest Jewish communities that exists here, predates the Declaration of Independence. And yet the core founder, who has a plaque now in Rhode Island of the Jewish community, who saved it post the British embargo, ran 2 transatlantic slave ship trades a year. We don't tell those stories when we talk about our ability to claim citizenry here in America and how our Jewish communities grew up in the shadow of white supremacy and made hard choices from the very first days we hit these shores for the sake of our survival that aligned us with whiteness and let go of the morality that Yehuda is talking about that should have defined our Jewishness. So I start there, and then I go forward. I go forward to the ways in which in the South we don't tell the story. We don't tell the stories of the ways in which Jewish men were lynched in the South for being Jews. And how, again, the American endeavor of aligning ourselves with Jewish values leaves out the ways in which Jewish bodies, Leo Frank is who I'm talking about, how Jewish bodies were hung just like black bodies, were accused of sexual deviation. In the case of Leo Frank, he was accused of raping a young white Christian girl. And before he could be tried, the Southerners dragged him out of the jail and lynched him on a tree, even though the judge had already acknowledged that he was falsely accused. Why is Leo Frank not listed as the progenitor, the case that created the ADL? Why is Leo Frank not listed as the origin of why we have a B'nai B'rith? Why is Leo Frank and the rise of white supremacy in this country not listed as what were the forces going on in this country that caused us to have to create uniquely Jewish spaces to protect ourselves from a scourge that was rising in this country in the 40s and 50s that was a flame that threatened our communal survival? So that fighting white supremacy wasn't necessarily about saving those poor unfortunate souls. Wasn't about identifying ourselves with the right and moral way to be as American. It was really about saving ourselves, about protecting the resources that we had garnered through the spaces with doors opened for us as Jews that did not simultaneously open for folks who were black under white supremacy. The reason why I take it slow is because those hard choices that I think we made from the days we hit the shores of the US continent, the shores of North America, and it's not just here in America, I go back up into all the spaces that we call North America. From the days we hit those shores in a colonialist enterprise, we were making choices about how we would grow as a Jewish community. And I feel like we can't hit a future. We were reaching for a multiracial democracy. We were reaching for things like pluralism without going back and telling the history of how we got to where we are right now. And also holding what Ta-Nehisi Coates teaches about reparations. If for 200 years, people of color, including Jews of color, have been living out the impacts of disparities of access, resource, and power in this country, while we have benefited from those same disparities, does the Jewish community not too need to participate in reparations? Does the Jewish community not too need to honor the ways in which we took a check that should not have been cashed under a canon of righteousness and morality? That, to me, is called Judaism. What do we do with that? I say from a place of beloved community that when I'm telling the story of Jewish identity, I want all of it. In a black body, I have no choice but to claim all of it. I want our history of solidarity. I want the history of those of us who were socialists. I want the history of us who were leftists. I want the history of those of us who actually did fight and who did resist. But I want that story also told alongside the stories of those of us who did not, including some of the founders of this very congregation. Rabbi Rafal, who actually was one of the only rabbis here in the New York State who championed slavery under Lincoln, who taught that it was actually a God-given right to have slaves from his Jewish pulpit in B'nai Jeshurun. The ways in which Jewish merchants here in New York actually created the slave clothing that was made of an inferior cotton that was only created by select merchants. And this was taught to me by Dr. Sana, who lives with me in Boston. He traced history that says that one of the reasons why there were many Jews in New York who did not support Lincoln was because we were some of the people that actually made that inferior fabric that clothed slaves. And freeing slaves would have been an opportunity for us to lose money, for us not to be able to maintain the access that we had gained in the shadow of white supremacy. How do we own that from a place of truth and reconciliation, from a place of reparation, from a place of beloved community? I don't have the opportunity to let go of any of us, not in history, not in the present, not in the future. Because if I and those like me are going to be free, we have to tell the whole story. But there's a cost to erasing white supremacy out of the story of Jewish institutional growth and Jewish identity formation in the United States. There's a cost to me, and there's a cost to my children, and there's a cost to all the people that I love. So I name white supremacy, and I push back on the stories in Jewish institutions where, for the sake of our Americanness and our collusion with an American identity that we wanted to adore, we ignored the stories of white supremacy that impacted our people.
Thank you. I want to kind of lift up two, many things in what you both just, reflections you both just shared, but two things in particular around the idea of the convenience of certain narratives that we tell about ourselves collectively as the American Jewish community. And of course, there is no the American Jewish community. And as you said, Yavilah, we've always been a mixed multitude. This is not something new. One is the convenience for those of us who identify as white, or others identify us as white. There is a convenience in that story of who we are because that's the dominant culture here. And through that, we gain access. Through that identity, we gain access to the resources that are available to people who are white in this country. And then there's the other stories that we tell or don't tell because we want to identify ourselves with certain values. So I don't know how many people, members of BJ, know that story about the rabbi of BJ. I don't think that's a story that we want to tell ourselves about who we are and who our leaders were and who members of this congregation were and members of our community were, because we have a certain set of values that we claim as our own, and those stories conflict with our values and tear up at that story we tell ourselves, or that picture we paint of ourselves of what our values are.
But they don't actually conflict with our values. What they conflict with is a specific value, which is believing that our history is intact. In other words, right, if the members of this congregation do not share Rabbi Rafal's values, what they may fear losing is the sense that they and their parents and grandparents have always been on quote unquote the right side of history.
Exactly.
That's the story that I think we want to tell, and I want to flag that that's not small. It's not small to acknowledge that the institutions that you participate in, that you belong to, have a spotty history. We work really hard, actually, as a people, constantly making sure that our texts and traditions don't feel like they're misrepresentative or dishonest about who and what we are. And I think many of us do want to look back, and think about it even just in a personal context. You discover something about a relative of yours who precedes you, who you love, and it's not great. So you have a cognitive dissonant moment. You can either suppress the facts, or you can embrace the difficulty of having come from something that you're embarrassed about. And most human beings, very legitimately, would rather suppress facts. That's how cognitive dissonance works. We actually want to retain our moral coherence. One of the things we've been thinking about, we are tuition-paying members of a Jewish day school. We were at the school dinner last year of the Jewish day school. And the Jewish Day School was celebrating the 50th anniversary of the school, or 55th, or whatever it was. And it's in the mid-60s. And the school is the unification of 3 schools from the Bronx that then got together and became one school in Riverdale. And the history that the school was telling about its founding it described this as like this amazing moment when these schools decided to get together and share their mission without acknowledging what everybody in the room knows was that it was the product of white flight from the Grand Concourse. That's why all of these people were moving to Riverdale. And of course the school isn't going to tell that story as being a critical feature and a shift in an American civic, the big story is a shift in American civic consciousness to say we're going to extricate ourselves out of here and move over here. Instead, the story that works to fundraise and to build the school is that we as Jews are opting into this form of Jewish education. And it correlates with a whole bunch of other values that are the product of the same moment. Jews look at the rise of black power in the 1960s and start taking pride in building Jewish ethnic consciousness. Jewish education emerges powerfully out of that moment. So it turns out we are not only fleeing from integrated community, we're also modeling our own Jewish education after something that's actually working to build black identity in America. Who wants to? How could you sell the school on that at that dinner by having that conversation? What you'd be implicitly doing is telling people your choices into Jewish education are coming with all sorts of social and political costs that you don't think you're actually incurring.
I think it's also important to like tether out the way in which our history of assimilation, and we do tell the story of our assimilation here in America. And when I look at the history in my research of the federations and the way the federations were formed, originally the federations were formed to be able to assimilate new immigrant populations into the United States and deal with quote unquote, the swarthy populations that came from Eastern Europe and other places that were considered too akin, too like the Negroes of the United States. Not white enough is the thing that I've never heard, but it is true that it made it harder in many of our communities to be able to assimilate when you had people coming from Russia, when you had people coming from places where they didn't necessarily uphold the model Americanness that many people, including the founder of the Reform movement, said was necessary in order for us to survive here. So the thing that I'm looking at in addition to this is that where do we tell the story of our resistance of assimilation and the shift in the way that changed when we got to the civil rights movement as a story of our empowerment as opposed to a continued story of our need to ascertain our survival. Why? Because it was only after FDR made pluralism and American, ethnicities, embracing American ethnicities from a pluralistic standpoint, an American thing, that we as Jewish communities, you start to hear it in our narrative, started to feel free to start talking about ourselves as an ethnicity. Prior to that point, we wanted to blend in. And anyone who talked about Jews as being distinctive or as a nation was shouted down as endangering the continuity of the Jewish people. So where does whiteness come in there? What happened when the Federation wrote a letter saying essentially that they did not want to accept immigrants from Greece? New York didn't want to take in Jewish immigrants from Greece and from various other Mizrahi, Sephardic heritage countries. Why? Because they would actually dilute in the same way we very openly talk about Eastern Europeans and Russians. We don't often talk about the Federation's history of not wanting to welcome Mizrahi communities into the New York fabric because they were called too Negro and Muslim-like. This is outright written in text that you can go and pick up and read. So white supremacy, how did our institutions grow up in the shadow of white supremacy and make hard choices not just about black folk, but make choices about folks who actually were the progenitors of our religion itself? What happens when you deny your own mother and father in the name of this crazy enterprise called white supremacy in the US? What did that do to our understanding of ourselves as Jews and as a people? I find those costs too high to bear. It's not just about helping folks who folks unfortunately misunderstand to be separate from the paradigm of whiteness, the equal sign between Jewish and whiteness that we allowed to flourish. Not just those folks, but the folks that preceded whiteness itself. There is no Jew who does not trace their ancestry, if they call themselves Jewish, going back to the beginning from the diasporas of the temple There's no Jew who will be able to translate that history beyond countries where black and brown people were indigenous. You can't do it. We don't start in Germany. We don't start in Mainz. We don't start in Poland. We start in the Middle East and Africa and Mesopotamia. And we don't have peyote and fur hats in those places. We don't have side locks and fur hats in those places. We look a lot like the places that were derived as savage once Christian white supremacy hit the globe, not just in the US, the globe. So it's something to think about.
So, Yavilah, you're lifting up a lot of the costs of not telling those stories and not embracing those pieces of our historical communities and how that has shaped what it means to be Jewish over the centuries. And Yehuda, you're speaking now in this present moment of the costs that would be incurred by actually starting to shift the narratives of, that school that you mentioned, which is the school where my children go, right? That would be a tremendous cost to that school to start telling a different story about how it came to be and start owning the responsibility and taking that, doing that self-accountability, the cheshbon hanefesh, of what it meant to create that school. So I think the question that I want to put out on the table, and I'll ask you to answer it after a brief public service announcement that will start collecting cards with questions. So if you have a question, write it down, and a few people will start to come around in a few minutes to collect those cards. The question I want to ask is, how do we actually, so Yavilah, you spoke about the costs of not telling certain stories as costs that we can no longer bear. And then the question is, how do we manage the costs of starting to change the narratives, both by embracing the stories and telling the full story of voices that have not been included, and actually starting to tell the truer stories that are not so pretty, that create that cognitive dissonance? How do we do that in a way without shaming ourselves, blaming ourselves, but also opening ourselves to realities, to truths that then enable us to move forward?
I just want to start there because I just want to say to folks that when I tell this story, this is new for me. I have not spent the last 20 years of my life as a Jewish professional talking about white supremacy. The first invitation I had to leadership was to talk about things like diversity and multiculturalism and inclusion and ways in which I could continue to align myself with the story that Jews are diverse. Jews are multicultural. We're a people that has come from across the globe, all without ever being able to name racism or white supremacy as relevant to that story. So it took many, many years before I could find it in my kishkas, in my back, to be able to tell this story from a place of honesty and transparency, because the risk was, by telling the story of my blackness, folks would then tell me I am not Jewish. By telling the story that we have to name white supremacy as relevant to the Jewish story in the US, I would get called radical. I would get told that I'm something outside of the Jewish liberal mainstream. I would get called out and said, I am angry. There's all these ways in which just telling the story that actually claimed this body as essential to Judaism left me at risk of losing partnership, left me at risk of losing funding, left me at risk of losing ways to define myself that I hadn't even figured out how to name, that I didn't even have language for, because there was no place for it. It was only when I started to organize among Jews of color and hear other Jews of color talk about the same journey, hear other Jews of color talk about holding this same pekel, as they called it. That's Yiddish, that means a backpack. But, holding this same thing on their back, that I started to realize, oh, if this really is an authentic Jewish story, then my job can also be to create spaces where this narrative is central and Jewish, where I don't accept or apologize for telling a story that has been our story from the beginning. So the cost has been that Jews of color have been so marginalized by our diversity and pluralism and inclusion efforts that often they can only be one of many. They can't be individuals. They can't be from Iraq. They can't be from Uzbekistan. They can't be from Ethiopia and Yemen and Turkey and Africa and I could go on and on and on. What does it mean that we all have to be held under one term called Jews of color, except that white supremacy is alive and well among us? How many different ways are there to derive Jewishness that includes something more than whiteness? So the cost has been creating space for Jews of color to be able to tell their own stories, to be centered, to be central, to be able to figure out what your voice sounds like when you're not holding your breath. How many different Jewish spaces have I navigated as a Jewish leader where I'm going to tell you I had to speak over holding my breath. My voice would go down and I had to cause it to rise back up. My back would feel unsteady and I had to sit into my hips and speak anyway. That's because white supremacy was with me in those Jewish spaces. The cost is that there's a way of being. In what shape do Jews of color arrive at the work of multiracial democracy and community? In what shape do Jews of color arrive at the work of inclusion and pluralism? I've learned that the cost is we never get to ask that question. Jews of color arrive at the point of being included in boards as adults. Jews of color arrive at the point of being able to name them as part of initiatives and committees. What about the 6-year-old Jews of color? What about the wives? What about the partners? What about the children? What about the whole families here in the US and abroad whose stories still have not been told as central? The cost is that I had to create that space by laying ground out in front of my feet in order to walk on. What we really need is to mitigate that cost by creating opportunities through funding, through Jewish outreach, through community building, through our federations, through our social action, where Jews of color can lead for ourselves, by ourselves, because our story and narrative is central to the Jewish paradigm. That's what's missing. And that doesn't mean that I'm letting go of anybody. That doesn't mean that I'm saying I don't want to be a multiracial, pluralistic, inclusive community. It means that there's a voice inside of me that doesn't get truly heard until I'm among my own outside of the paradigm of white supremacy and whiteness in Jewish spaces. And when I hear that voice, and when I see that voice, and all the work that I'm doing right now to create spaces for that, we cry, and we laugh, and we shake, and we stomp, and we actually revel in the idea that this Jewish voice matters. So the cost is not creating spaces for that to happen. And if it hasn't been said, and even if I have to risk discomfort, and even if I have to risk folks saying, well, that made me uncomfortable, I don't know what she's talking about. If that's the case, that's fine. But it's worth it for every face that I've looked into at 6 that knows its power. When a 6-year-old smiles and dances in joy and says, hey, Yavilah, then I know that the Jewish community is going to be more whole. Because she is the future. She is the future of our community. And so is he, and so is they, and so is we, and so is us. But until we get white supremacy out from in the middle of us, we are never going to get there. So that's the cost. That's the cost. It's not an American problem, it's a Jewish problem.
I want to say a couple things, Yavilah. First, and it goes to why I feel honored to be on the stage with you, because you've been a leader in this work for a long time, and I haven't. It's not been where my work has been. And I know it's a big deal then for you to have me on the stage together with you. And that is to say, you know, as is the case with a whole bunch of other structural injustices, I think one of the commitments that I want to make and that I want my institution to make and others is that it's not the responsibility of people of color primarily or exclusively to dismantle white supremacy. That's like saying that it's the responsibility of women to eliminate misogyny. That would be crazy. And I do think that part of what I what I am concerned about in our current climate is that in order for for Jews of color to emerge in this context, there's a kind of claiming of the mantle of dismantling white supremacy, when in fact it actually has to be a collective enterprise that the folks who actually benefit from those infrastructure are leading as opposed to following.
Amen. Can you say that again?
Probably not, but it's recorded and it's online. And we are happy to share at another time. Our institution is exploring what it would look like for us to use some of the privilege that's at our disposal within the organized Jewish community to do that kind of work in our community, in order to avoid what I am nervous is also happening, is not just that because Jews of color are owning this agenda, the quote-unquote mainstream Jewish community isn't. The other problem is that because of the politically partisan climate that we're in, a whole bunch of associations, coalitions, and affiliations are deeply disincentivizing white passing Jews from engaging not just in the business of dismantling white supremacy, but involved in any of the work of racial justice altogether, as being viewed as an anti-Israel activity, as an activity in which the coalitions are viewed as rotten compromise. And that doesn't just damage the capacity to heal injustices within the context of the Jewish community, but it moves white Jews out of that conversation altogether. So we have some work institutionally and communally to be engaged there as well. The second piece that I wanted to talk about is you mentioned the Yovel before in reference to your name. So the Yovel in Leviticus is imagined as the Bible's envisioning of a moment in which, on a regular basis, a society would radically transform itself to eliminate structural poverty. The Yovel is about by 2-3 generations, you've inherited debt to the generations that come after you. And the Bible wants to imagine the possibility of radical transformation back to the original paradigm of shared land ownership resets to its original owner, and the covenantal relationship between human beings and God is restored because there aren't human beings who are enslaving and indebting other human beings. That's the vision. And the thing that is so arresting about that vision is that simultaneously it offers a paradigm for the transformation of our society. When people talk about eliminating white supremacy and reparations in order to get back to what is American democracy actually supposed to be about without its inherent built-in hypocrisies? The core problem is that we never did the Yovel. The rabbis tell us that the Yovel never got enacted. And the reason it never gets enacted, this is exactly your question, Shuli, is because if you were going to actually get people to eliminate debt structures, the people who hold the power in that relationship are going to be extremely reluctant to participate in the Yovel. In other words, any real imagination of societal transformation involves loss. And it's financial loss, and it's not just memory and narrative and nostalgia and religion and imagination. It's not all those things. It's money and capital. And so I feel caught between the imagination of the Yovel, what would it look like for us to dramatically change the society, and to listen to the indictment that Chazal, that our teachers are offering us, which is Yovel is set up as a model that can't work. I feel indicted by that, and it therefore pushes me towards what I know are basically bourgeois politics of what is the incremental change that we could make in our society that would remedy some of past injustices but never fully eradicate them. And I know every time I talk about this, and I don't talk about it in this context, but I talk about it in relationship to Israel-Palestine or other issues, I have somebody who comes onto my Facebook page or in the audience and reads me King's letter from a Birmingham jail in which he talks about the bourgeois politics of the white quote-unquote allies, telling us you have to move slowly and you have to change this and you can't incur this kind of loss because it won't work. So I know it's there and I know it's the problem, but I also am listening to the rabbinic recognition that imagining the social transformation, even of the Yovel, of our ultimate paradigm of societal transformation, is just invites so much resistance and so much hostility out of the fear of loss that I don't that's where I'm living, and that's where I'm stuck, and that's where I need help.
So I have a different midrash. You know, there's a way in which the Yovel is also announced by the call of the Shofar. And the call of the Shofar, as we know from the high holiday ceremonies that we enact even today, is supposed to call you into relationship with a sense of empathy. The shofar sounds like a baby crying. It sounds like a wail. So as you hear the shofar, what's supposed to be enacted within you is a sense of your compassion, a sense of your being implicated by somebody else's pain. We have not blown the shofar that allows us to feel so implicated by others' pain that we're willing to give up access to resources, power, and privilege in order to realize the higher humanity that the shofar is calling for. That would be Jubilee. That would be Yovel. And where did we get the shofar? We got the shofar from Abraham, who was willing to give up his most precious gift, his own son, sacrifice his own son in the name of his higher morality and his higher consciousness. And then God gave the shofar as a replacement for that. No, don't give me everything you got. Take the shofar and blow it so people will remember who we are. Remember where we came from. Remember that I don't want your highest sacrifice. I just want you to be a moral and righteous and kindness-loving people. I believe that we can do this. I believe that the lies we were told by capitalism and by colonialism and by racism and white supremacy in this country, that land or people can be owned, when the Yovel taught us that none of us own anything, because in that 50th year, everything returns to God. I believe that if we ever really believed that it wasn't owning things that made us who we are as humanity, it was living in equitable community with others that made us who we are as humanity, that we would realize something else that the Yovel is supposed to announce, which is the era of the Messiah. There's another drash here. The drash is, even though we haven't seen it yet, it can be possible. Even though we haven't lived it yet, the shofar can remind us of opportunities. And I really, really deeply believe that that's what the Jewish enterprise is about. Not doing what we've seen, but doing the things that the world has never seen. That's the kind of Jew that I'm here to testify.
I think there are many places in the Jewish tradition where we are asked to live in the tension between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And Yovel and Shemitah are perhaps the foremost example of that. And one way that I've thought about this, and even Shemitah, which is practiced today and has been practiced, is modified with so many loopholes that gets people out of what the real practice of Shemitah is, that 7th year. It does push us, if we actually look at it closely, to say what are the values, and I think this is what you're getting at, Yavilah, what are the values that are animating that system, even if it cannot be lived and practiced and enacted as it's described in the Torah. And how do we then take those values, and use that to craft our lives, our families, our communal spaces, our politics? Maybe that does end up leading us to, as you said, Yehuda, bourgeoisie politics of incrementalism. But I also think that that is a piece of spiritual work of holding a certain mentality that is very countercultural. And that may actually allow us to create bigger change within, if not on the political level, within our communities. And so this is the question that I want to ask next, and then we'll turn to some of the questions that folks from the audience have. You have written, or the Hartman Institute just recently published a white paper on courageous leadership. What does leadership on partisan issues and in very polarized political climate look like? And how Jewish leaders have been trapped by many of the traps that exist in our political climate today. And as you said, race has become hugely polarizing. So what does courageous leadership look like for both of you, for each of you? How do Jewish leaders in particular rise above the fray, lead on this issue in a way that acknowledges some of the costs that may be incurred, make ourselves, or those of us who are white, vulnerable to incurring those costs, and embrace the full multiculturalism and multiracial identity that is our American Jewish community? Tell us what to do.
I'll say two short things. One is in our work on courageous leadership in that paper, we diagnosed two issues that are intersecting with each other. One is the vulnerability that Jewish communal professionals have to put themselves into dangerous places on complicated issues. And so we looked at what are the features in Jewish life, especially over the late 20th, early 20th century, and in American life more broadly, that are coming to bear on these issues, and what are the incentives that are in place for professionals to do this kind of work. The goal of being a leader of the Jewish people is not surviving during the duration of your tenure as a leader. The goal of being a leader of the Jewish people is actually, as we've talked about, bridging the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. You can come to the conclusion that, like Moses, you're supposed to you don't have to see the change in the world, or like Choni, but you have to be able to say at the end of your lifetime, I did something, and that's the courage that we want out of Jewish leaders. And the second piece of it was identifying where our community is falling short at scaffolding that kind of leadership and not savaging it. So it's not just about the individuals are involved, it's actually about the communal infrastructure that wants to incentivize courageous work as opposed to what it's currently doing, which is undermining it. One of the big targets of that paper, now I'm saying this on the record, it's complicated, is Jewish philanthropy. And the good thing is that the philanthropists who overwhelmingly read this paper knew that they were implicated in it. And they said, we're actually not helping Jewish professionals right now because we are oftentimes holding them accountable to our very limited goals that we have and undermining them whenever they take a step at pushing. And if the people paying the bills of Jewish life are holding back our leaders, then what they're doing is holding back the Jewish people. So what has to shift here is in the economy of Jewish life. It's not simply, what you don't want to have happen is that people perceive this as a risky conversation, and unique individuals then think that their job is to then essentially be prophets. One of the great problems of tragedies of the prophets is that the people beat them up. Don't listen to them. The only prophet in the Hebrew Bible who people listen to is Jonah, and that's because he's talking to Gentiles, right? And he ran away, right? I mean, we really abuse our prophets. We don't want the image of the people who see what's righteous to simply be the prophetic identity. The work that we have to do here, and it really depends on what position you're in. I've learned a lot from my friend and teacher Shofar Brosnik about leadership. The work of leadership is not about evaluating what position you're in, but figuring out what are the tools at your disposal and what are the levers and moving. I think there are a lot of folks in this room and elsewhere who can be responsible more for the climate and then creating the conditions for courageous work. And there are other people in this room who are going to then be the individuals who can move the community forward once they believe that they have some sort of net and some sort of scaffold. I admire the work you're doing here. I admire the participation of a community that says, I'm going to go even though I may feel implicated, or I'm going to show up if I'm a Jew of color knowing that I'm going to be only a handful of people in the room, and that even though it's talking about race and us, it's probably not going to be that comfortable to be the people who other people are looking at and saying, aren't we happy that we have people of color in our room? So we have to figure out who we are in all of these stories, where we wield power and privilege and therefore can move our institutions, and where are the individuals who then we're giving space to actually to do that kind of work. So it's an ecosystemic analysis, and it requires all of us to see that picture and to figure out where are the levers.
I mean, you said it, I talk a lot about beloved community, but I think beloved, like doing the work of creating beloved community is an act of courageous leadership. Because to some extent, to call somebody who you don't know and who you're not really sure what their lived experience is or where they're coming from politically, socially, culturally, beloved to you, is a courageous act. Because you could get into beloved, what you're calling beloved relationship with somebody, and actually they're going to smack you. Actually what's going to happen is you're going to get hurt. Actually what's going to happen is they're going to tell you wait 20 years and then eventually you'll get onto the agenda. With that being the case, engaging in beloved community, the reason why I think that's courageous leadership is because when you say there's something bigger at stake here, that I'm willing to risk my own safety, I'm willing to risk my own comfort, to stay in relationship with you regardless, it takes a lot of courage to do that. because everything in your being sometimes is going to tell you, get somewhere else and get safe. Leave the community. Go find some other folks. Go find something else to do. It's easier out there. Don't stay here with these folks who are making you meshuggah, right? Like, don't do that. That's what your natural response is. And I don't think this is just related to race. Anyone who's ever felt marginalized, your first instinct towards survival is to get away from the folks who are making you feel uncomfortable, right? So for every person that exists in a marginalized category and stays in Jewish community regardless, they've taken on a risk. They've risked those imprints on their soul that may make them wake up one day and not really feel the sense of humanity that they were born into the world as their gift, as their inheritance. One day you may wake up and not even know who you are because you spent so much time with people who were confused about your humanity and dignity. And yet you stay anyway. Every time you meet one of those people, you have to realize you're looking at a courageous leader. You're looking at somebody who has risked a lot to be here anyway. And I think on the other side, folks who do come from a place of privilege or from a place of comfort and feel like they have so much to lose by engaging in issues of racial equity, to hold equitably first, that the fact that you're getting to a point to even have a choice about that risk is a reason for you to engage in it, because there are so many others who never got that choice and are here anyway. So what is this about your choice, about risk and comfort? What is it really? Are you holding it equitably? There's a way in which when Michael Brown, you know, the story of Michael Brown, who was shot by a police officer, regardless of where people fell around the Michael Brown and the Trayvon Martin murders, there was a day in my house when I looked at the television and I saw that Michael Brown's body was in the street for 6 hours uncovered, dead, and no one in that community saw fit to either cover the body or insist that that body be removed from the street. I saw that as my Jewish problem. And the reason why is because as an Orthodox Jew, I know what kavod hamet is. What does it mean to respect a dead body? And the fact that I lived in a world where so many people had such little respect for a dead body, regardless of what happened prior to that they would allow a bleeding dead body to be in public, that they refused the mother of that child the ability to go and recover the body. To me, that was something that ran against my Jewish values, regardless of what I felt about the racial equity and political issues that came up. Courage and moral equity in this generation is having the courage to live into our Jewish values, even when they're unpopular. Because I feel like our Jewish values teach us something about humanity that trumps racism. And yes, I'm using the pun. It does. So there's a way in which resisting the assimilation, being willing to stand up unpopularly for Jewish values, is also something about moral courage. And not waiting for those who are targeted by society to be the ones to raise up their Jewishness as exemplary or different, or because they've got some vested interest in it. I believe that requires moral courage. And the last thing I'm going to say is, you know what? There's ways in which this is not profitable. Saying the things that I'm saying are not profitable. It's courageous also to divorce ourselves from what anti-Semitism has taught us, which is that if we don't have enough money or prestige or power, somebody's going to come and kill us. And therefore, we have to amass resources to be able to protect our community. What if there's a fight for spirit that is going to protect us in ways that money and access and privilege and power never can? That's, to me, moral courage, to be able to live into that space and find out what's next.
So here's a question. How do we take a cheshbon hanefesh in present time? How we live here in the Upper West Side and perpetuate racist society, living segregated from our black and brown neighbors, wages, standard of living discrepancies. I'm going to give this question to you, Yavilah. I imagine this comes up a lot in the work that you do with white folks.
Say the top of it again.
How do we take a cheshbon hanefesh in present time and look at the ways that we as white people, or those of us who are white, live in systems that perpetuate racism?
I don't know. I go back to my Jewish education, and so I'm telling y'all things that I believe. Maybe you know these things, maybe you don't. Either way, just hear me out as it being centered in my experience. When I first learned about Cheshbon HaNefesh, I learned about it in the context of tshuva, and that the way in which you do repentance, reparation, healing, is to start with introspection and to look into yourself and find out what brought me to that action that hurt someone else. What are the conditions? How do I change those conditions the next time I find myself in those conditions, which I'm likely to do? And how will I tell after I meet those conditions that I have actually done tshuva because I engaged in alternative behavior? There's a way in which waiting for, cheshbon HaNefesh to come out of the sky probably isn't the way for us to be able to actually engage in reconciliation. Be human. You're gonna do the same thing you did last time, and it's gonna hurt. You're gonna step on somebody's toe, and it's gonna hurt. You're gonna do something that ignores somebody's humanity and dignity, and it's gonna hurt. The cheshbon HaNefesh is, do you know it hurt? Or are you waiting for them to tell you? If you know it hurt, how much time did you spend imagining yourself not doing that same thing next time? And who are you checking in with to be sure that when you change your behavior, you have the impact that you're actually reaching for? Believe it or not, I just ran you through the course of DEI work. This is the work I do all the time around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Naming our own behaviors, owning them as having impact, checking in with the folks who are targeted by our behavior, and then engaging in alternative behavior when you come back around the same prospect for engaging in that behavior again. How many of us, when you talk about cheshbon HaNefesh, are willing to be courageous enough to put ourselves to that accountability standard? You know what you're doing. You know what you're doing. You willing to change it? You willing to risk being uncomfortable to be able to engage in alternative behavior? Something about our comfort tells us we shouldn't have to do that, right? We're the generation of you do you, right? You do you. It's all about me, right? The individualism of our society. I should get to do what I want to do. Maybe not from a place of cheshbon HaNefesh. Maybe you shouldn't just get what you want to do. Maybe what you should get is in relationship with others and hold the impact of your actions. And be in cheshbon HaNefesh. Be in self-introspection until you can figure out that you're the type of human being walking around not hurting anybody for the sake of your own movement forward. Maybe you should be the type of human being that's helping other people by checking in with them and seeing, how did my life, how did my living make your life a little better? To me, that's cheshbon HaNefesh.
This is, I think, in some ways a corollary to that question. How do we introduce and interrogate and name white fragility as a concept into our shuls and schools, given how much racism exists in those educational frameworks and how much unnamed white fragility exists in those institutions?
I have a weird dispositional thing that connects to my work, which is that I find the notion of this is too scary to talk about annoying, and therefore I guess one of the ways that I shield against that, or at least that I'm able to do it, is that I actually think the more rigorous and analytical and intellectual that we do around that work, which is different from the framing of beloved community, I acknowledge it, actually helps, because it actually it attaches sources of credibility like scholarship, etc., that become a different type of impetus for people to take the idea seriously, to actually do that work. I'm not hugely enamored by taking phrases and making them the dominant work of education. So white fragility is one of the phrases where if you say to a community, we're going to spend the next year talking about white fragility, you're not likely to enlist people into the work. But being able to invite congregations and Hillels and JCCs and day schools to talk about who are we in the world and accountability, and it's not like race doesn't exist as a conversation that's out there. There are ways in which actually the more rigorous we do it, you actually are doing more of the work than simply trying to acknowledge that phrases like white fragility are triggering to fragile white people, right? If that's the case, then I don't know that the work is really testing and pushing to become less fragile. I think the work is actually, let's study this, let's become accountable. One of the peers who I learn with on these issues is my colleague Dr. Rivka Schwartz, who's a teacher at SAR High School, and she's the person I've been talking to about day schools and white flight. And one of the things that's so powerful of learning with her is that she's also running a day school. In other words, she's not invested in interrogating questions of structural racism that are at the core of the day school in order to dismantle the day school. She really believes in Jewish education. She sends her kids to day school. She's an educator there. She just wants to hold accountable a mirror to do the work that you're talking about, Cheshbon Nefesh, to say, in what ways does a commitment to Jewish education, why does that have to be necessarily accompanied by a history and a present of the Jewish educational infrastructure built on the basis of white supremacy? They don't. They don't have to live together. I could simultaneously be committed to Jewish education, including private Jewish education, which means that you're going to have people of color in your community, but you are policing a boundary between Jews and non-Jews, and I can talk about that openly and candidly, and I can be committed to that goal, and I can name the systems and structures in which this work is taking place. And that's why I think part of the work is educational, and it's rigor, and it's attaching history and real deep inquiry into this, because that's also what we do as Jews, right? That's a Jewish thing to do, is to say, if I care about something and if I care about my values, one way in which I do it is I do as much deep learning as I can so I can be really good at that. That's where I would love to see this, some of this work takes place, is through that kind of rigor.
I think, it's interesting. I'm listening to you, and surprisingly, I actually agree with you on some of what you just said, even though usually someone would say that and it would cause me to go in a different direction. But tonight, I actually found myself agreeing with you on one thing, which is that, this way of being Jewish by words as opposed to behavior, right, is not something I agree with. I think that I should know and be able to recognize you as my Jewish sibling by how you behave, not just by how many books you've read and how many words you know and how many phrases you can run at me. I should be able to recognize you as my sibling by how you behave with me as a Jew, I believe, right? So there's a way in which, in movement spaces and in the work that we are doing, from the place of political action, that we've started to kind of check each other on, do you have the right word? Can you break down in 5 different ways what white fragility is for me? Can you say all the different isms in 5 seconds without taking a breath? There are ways in which the cognitive of what it means to build equity is trumping in our society the behaviors of what it actually, really being clear on what are the behaviors we act out every day that hold equity. So to me, I don't really care whether folks use the term white fragility or not. I wanted to acknowledge that people had to come up with the term white fragility to name a bunch of behaviors that nobody could name prior to that term coming up that actually were hurting them. That I'm interested in. I want a very long conversation about that. But I don't really care whether you use the term white fragility. I care that you're able to associate your behavior with the capacity to hurt another human being by being so caught up in your sense of feelings or your sense of emotionality that it stops you from noticing that there's somebody else here who actually would like to talk to you about a history of systemic injustices, that they are actually living the impacts out every day, and what you're holding right now is how you felt about the last 2 words I just said. If you have all of that, and you can get that, great. I don't care what word you use. Doesn't really matter to me. So I agree with you there, and I also want to connect it to the Jewish thing that we have 613 daggone commandments. Okay, if Jews are all about this and cognitive, what do you need so many things to do for? What do you need it for? 613 different things you have to do. Not even optional, have to, according to the traditional interpretation. Because we are about doing. So we don't sit around and think about how do we do it, as opposed to how we think about it, how erudite we are in describing it, as opposed to how erudite we are in actually living it. I find myself in agreement with you. I don't think we're educating our young people appropriately. I think folks should be able to walk up and tell me, I do this because I'm a Jew. I do this because it is a part of who I must live as a Jewish human being in this world. When I meet young people that are that clear on the way their walk is Jewish, on the way their history, their ancestry, their whole Weltanschauung of the world, right, has been flavored by a Judaism that preaches forward, oh, those are the leaders I want to run with. Those are the ones that I think are strong and powerful. I love those folks dearly. And I think it's about getting out of here and getting into here and getting into here. And there I agree with you. I think I agree with you 100%.
I'm going to close us out with one last question in 30 seconds or less. What is a next step for people in this room or for BJ as a community?
I would say, look, I've learned a lot just from listening tonight to you, Yavilah, and that's a commitment that I'm continuing to make around with the acknowledgement that, like, on this issue, I agree with a lot of what you have to say, and I'm learning from it on a whole bunch of other issues. I listen and talk to people whose policy prescription I disagree with. I do the painful thing of reading publications that I hate. Sometimes I hate read them. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. Both because sometimes they may be betraying some truth that I have to be able to reconcile with, and sometimes because if I don't actually engage with their ideas, I can't even argue effectively with them. So just a commitment to listening. I think that one of the things that you've been doing when you say you want to be behind people and pushing them forward is trying to identify who are the leaders and thinkers who represent Jews of color in our community who just simply haven't been amplified. And one of the commitments I want to make, and maybe this is something that could be taken elsewhere, is that people don't become popular thinkers and teachers by virtue of their own charisma. They become popular teachers and thinkers because they get amplified by others who are saying this is someone you should be listening to. So I think I want to do the work personally of trying to figure out how to both amplify explicitly and implicitly by simply seeking that out as a Torah to learn from.
Amen, amen. I don't know. I'm trying to think and not just say the thing that needs to be said. The thing I want, if you ask me what I want, that's where I'll go to this. What I want is for Jews of color not to be tokenized by whatever it is we do next. Mm-hmm. And when I say tokenized, I mean don't over-celebrate us for being who we are and celebrate us for who we are. It's kind of like that Audre Lorde thing, right? Forget that I am black and never forget that I am black. I am in that kind of conundrum right now about what I ask for from my partners and allies and community. And what I think is that don't make us part of strategies that are in service of a vision for Jewish community that essentially is serving white majority interests. Give us some space to actually have interests. Give us some space to actually be self-determinant. Invest in our power for the sake of just our power, not because it's going to make your institution any greater, not because it gives you a different way to be constructed in the current political moment around whiteness, not because it's politically expedient, because you're looking at somebody that you love, and because that person has loved you enough to stay here and to be here anyway, just for that. Love them back by creating space for them to live into their power. And I'm asking for that because I now have been in this work for the lifetime of my oldest child. My oldest child now is 23, and she's about to graduate Princeton. And it pains me that the world has changed a whole lot, but I'm still looking at a young, beautiful Jewish woman who still lives out patterns of isolation, that still isn't, gets crazy comments made when she goes to the Hillel, that still doesn't know that she's beautiful at the essence of herself without having to validate it in Jewish spaces by asserting her strength. How long will my children have to be resilient? Will you help me? Will you help me when you bump into a young JOC by just giving them your warmth and your solidarity without asking them for a thing? Will you help me by, if you hear anything that sounds like an equal sign between Jewish and whiteness, you be the one to say, actually, we are a multiracial community from our birth, and I am a part of a multiracial family, and therefore any way in which you're leaving out my siblings is not welcome to me. Like, will you all do that work so that the work I've done for 23 years becomes a legacy to my own babies who need it? They need it. I want my daughter to be free. I want all my children to be free. And I can't do that for myself. So I need your help. That's what I would ask. I need your help.
Thank you so much. That is a beautiful, powerful agitation and charge to end on. I hope that you will all continue to be in this conversation with us. Our next lecture is on December 4th with Alana Kaufman, and then January 9th with Dr. Cheryl Greenberg. Thank you so much, Yehuda and Yavilah, for your tremendous insights and wisdom and lived experience that I hope will enable our community to take some of the steps that you asked of us tonight. Thank you.